The text message was just a few words long, but it was enough to unravel an entire family living on someone else's dime. My husband, Grant Mercer, thought he was finally discarding his boring wife. He had no idea the woman he was banishing was the only load-bearing pillar keeping his estate, his business, and his family's filthy secrets from collapsing. By the end of that winter gala, the only question left was who would be dragged out first. My name is Brianna Cook. I am 34 years old, and for the past 5 years, I have worked as the Director of Compliance Investigation at Harrogate Assurance, a premier corporate risk management firm located in the sleek financial district of Charlotte. My daily professional existence is dictated by ledgers, behavioral patterns, and the cold, unyielding logic of financial forensics. I am paid a very substantial salary to track exactly where money originates, precisely why it moves through various channels, and specifically who is trying to conceal its ultimate destination. In my line of work, you learn to strip away the emotional narrative and look only at the structural integrity of a situation. Therefore, when my personal phone vibrated against the polished walnut surface of my office desk at exactly 2:15 in the afternoon on a quiet Tuesday, I did not anticipate that the notification would become the most critical, devastating piece of personal data I would process all year. The high-resolution screen illuminated, displaying a brief text message from my husband, Grant Mercer. It read, "We've decided to distance ourselves from you. Don't come looking for us." I sat perfectly still, my eyes locked on the glowing pixels. I did not gasp in shock. I did not drop the device in a fit of trembling despair. According to the biometric sensors on the smartwatch strapped tightly to my left wrist, my resting heart rate remained entirely stable at 68 beats per minute. I simply analyzed the data in front of me. I read those 2 brief sentences a second time. The syntax was too polished, the phrasing too utterly devoid of Grant's usual dramatic, self-pitying flair. The use of the royal we was the definitive, undeniable giveaway. That was not my husband speaking to me. That was the unmistakable, perfectly manicured voice of my mother-in-law, Lorraine Mercer, echoing through his thumbs. To Lorraine, I had never been a cherished daughter-in-law, nor had I ever been viewed as a true equal partner to her precious son. I was merely a structural inconvenience she was forced to tolerate, a walking, breathing line of unlimited credit, meant to be quietly bled dry while remaining entirely out of sight during her social engagements. They had clearly sat together in her overly perfumed, velvet-draped sitting room, drinking midday wine and convincing each other that they were finally, bravely discarding a boring, overly controlling woman from their glamorous, superior lives. I did not shed a single tear. I did not desperately dial his number to beg for an explanation or demand a chance to defend my role in our marriage. I did not ask what I had supposedly done wrong to warrant such a cold dismissal. Instead, I placed my phone flat on the desk, opened my heavily encrypted personal messaging application, and typed exactly 1 sentence in reply. I formally informed him that I was immediately and permanently terminating all financial disbursements, corporate guarantees, and asset protections that his family had grown completely accustomed to utilizing. I hit send. The delivery receipt confirmed the message was read a mere 10 seconds later. To fully comprehend the sheer, breathtaking audacity of their text message, you have to understand the man I married. Grant loved nothing more than to introduce himself at upscale cocktail parties and charity dinners as a visionary brand strategist. It was a fabricated title that sounded incredibly expensive, but required absolutely zero tangible output or daily effort. In harsh reality, Grant had been completely unemployed for 14 consecutive months. He spent his aimless days sitting in artisan coffee shops, drafting flashy, entirely hollow business proposals for imaginary lifestyle brands that never progressed past the digital presentation stage. Meanwhile, I quietly paid the substantial mortgage on our upscale townhouse, covered the exorbitant lease payments on his imported European sports car, and funded the bespoke, tailor-made suits he wore to networking meetings that never, not once, resulted in a single paycheck. He lived his entire existence inside an insulated bubble constructed entirely of my funding. dreaming of vast corporate empires while I tirelessly swept up the accumulating dust of his perpetual failures. He genuinely believed his own meticulously crafted lie. He believed he was always on the verge of a massive, industry-disrupting breakthrough, and that my pragmatic, relentlessly numbers-driven approach to our life was the only thing stifling his boundless creative genius. However, Grant's profound delusions were merely a localized symptom of a much larger, deeply entrenched generational disease. The true epicenter of their unearned arrogance and financial absurdity was White Laurel Estate, the Mercer family's supposedly legendary crown jewel. It was a sprawling, allegedly historic luxury event venue situated on several acres of pristine, aggressively manicured land in the highly affluent outer suburbs of Charlotte. Lorraine Mercer never missed a single opportunity to aggressively remind the local society pages, her country club acquaintances, and anyone within earshot that White Laurel was a sacred family legacy. She hosted elaborate seasonal galas, draped herself in imported silk, and poured vintage champagne for the local political and social elite, acting at all times as though the very ground she walked upon was paved with the gold of her ancestors. The objective truth was far less photogenic. Exactly 3 years ago, that precious, untouchable family legacy was exactly 4 weeks away from facing complete, irreversible foreclosure. Lorraine had managed to run the primary operational accounts completely into the ground. She consistently prioritized her exorbitant private club dues, her personal designer wardrobe, and her cosmetic enhancements over mundane matters like property taxes and essential vendor invoices. The magnificent estate was suffocating under massive county tax liens and an insurmountable mountain of severely past due debt owed to everyone from high-end caterers to local groundskeepers. They were on the absolute brink of losing everything, facing devastating public humiliation and total, inescapable financial ruin. That was precisely when I stepped in. I did not intervene for their gratitude, which was ultimately a very good thing, considering they never offered a single word of genuine thanks. I intervened because, at that specific time in my life, I still foolishly believed that saving my husband's family from themselves was my marital duty. I quietly leveraged my own substantial personal capital and utilized highly specialized corporate holding structures to entirely buy out the toxic debt. I became their silent, totally invisible savior. I fixed the deep financial rot, stabilized the crumbling foundation, and allowed them to continue playing lords of the manor, completely shielding them from the harsh, unforgiving reality of their own staggering incompetence. Now they had decided they wanted to distance themselves. They wanted the boring, pragmatic wife totally out of the picture so they could enjoy their perceived success without my shadow falling over their delusions. They just conveniently forgot who owned the picture frame. I calmly swiveled my ergonomic office chair toward my secondary, high-resolution monitor and logged directly into my secure master banking dashboard. The large screen rapidly populated with a dozen different accounts, blind holding companies, and automated transfer directives. It was time to give them exactly what they had so boldly requested: absolute distance. My fingers moved across the mechanical keyboard with the steady, ruthlessly practiced rhythm of an elite auditor systematically dismantling a complex corporate fraud scheme. First, I located the automated monthly cash flow offset directive. This was the invisible transfer of thousands of dollars that I injected directly into White Laurel's primary operating account on the first day of every single month, done solely to keep their payroll checks and utility payments from bouncing. I clicked the green active toggle. The status immediately changed to canceled. Next, I opened the secure payment portal for the county tax assessor's office. The quarterly property tax payment, a staggering multi-thousand-dollar sum that Lorraine had conveniently forgotten to budget for over the past decade, was currently queued for automatic release at the end of the current business day. I highlighted the pending transaction and permanently deleted the authorization. I then moved steadily on to the venue's vendor management system. I quickly located the standing corporate financial guarantee I had personally signed for their premier, high-volume floral supplier. This ironclad legal guarantee was the one and only reason the most exclusive, in-demand florist in all of Charlotte still willingly delivered thousands of imported roses and orchids to Lorraine's extravagant events on open credit. I formally revoked the guarantee, marking the action effective immediately. Then came the comprehensive risk management suite. High-limit event liability insurance is the absolute, non-negotiable lifeblood of any luxury venue. Without an active policy, you cannot legally host a single paying guest or serve a single drop of alcohol. I had been quietly paying the massive annual premium out of my own secondary holding firm to keep the doors open. I drafted a brief, legally binding, formal notice of immediate policy cancellation and transmitted it directly to the underwriter. Finally, I accessed the commercial equipment leasing agreements. The massive stainless steel, commercial-grade refrigeration units, currently humming inside the White Laurel catering kitchens, were not actually owned by the estate, despite Lorraine's claims to the contrary. They were leased on a strict multi-year contract, and I was the sole personal financial guarantor listed on the binding paperwork. I formally submitted a demand for termination of the lease request and officially scheduled a priority retrieval order for the leasing company to reclaim their highly expensive equipment. The entire devastating process took exactly 12 minutes to complete. I leaned back in my chair and looked calmly at the series of digital confirmation screens glowing before me. I felt absolutely no sudden surge of vindictive, burning rage. I felt no suffocating wave of melodramatic sorrow or heartbreak. There was only the cold, deeply satisfying, entirely sterile feeling of finally correcting a massive, long-standing mathematical error. I was not destroying their lives with petty, chaotic emotional outbursts. I was simply, systematically, and legally unscrewing every single hidden structural bolt that had kept their fragile, counterfeit empire standing upright. They wanted to be entirely independent of me. By the time the sun finally set over the Charlotte skyline tonight, they were going to learn exactly how much true independence actually cost. Exactly 14 minutes passed. I was still staring at the confirmation screens of my previous cancellations when my secondary phone, the heavily encrypted device issued exclusively for high-level corporate banking alerts, vibrated violently against the polished wood of my desk. The screen flashed a brilliant, urgent red, signaling a priority notification. It was a Level 1 commercial fraud alert, automatically generated by the strict proprietary security algorithm I had personally configured for the estate's financial architecture. I picked up the device. The notification detailed a massive, unauthorized outbound wire transfer. The origin account was the primary operational reserve fund for the venue. The requested amount was exactly $82,000. I felt a cold, sharp spike of adrenaline, the specific kind of chemical rush that sharpens analytical focus rather than clouds it with panic. I tapped the screen to expand the transaction details. The receiving institution was a mid-sized regional bank, and the beneficiary account belonged to a corporate entity registered as Blue Peak Digital Strategy. The name alone was a full confession. Blue Peak Digital Strategy was not a legitimate corporate vendor, nor was it a recognizable contractor. It was a fabricated, hollow shell of an agency owned and operated exclusively by Devin Price. Devin was married to my husband's younger sister, Paige. He was a man who unironically described himself on professional networking sites as a disruptive event marketing guru. Yet his primary source of revenue seemed to consist of pitching wildly overpriced, fundamentally useless social media campaigns to gullible local business owners. He wore perfectly tailored suits, possessed a blindingly white smile that never quite reached his eyes, and constantly spoke in hollow corporate buzzwords like synergy and dynamic outreach. He and my husband frequently spent entire weekend afternoons smoking imported cigars on the back terrace, plotting elaborate, aggressively stupid schemes to monetize the family brand. Now, they were attempting to monetize it by directly looting the vault. I did not waste a single second attempting to contact Grant, nor did I consider calling Lorraine to demand an explanation. Instead, I picked up my office landline and punched in the direct, unlisted extension for the commercial fraud division at the principal holding bank. Because I managed a corporate portfolio worth tens of millions of dollars in my professional capacity, My profile bypassed the standard customer service queues entirely. The line rang exactly twice before a senior risk analyst named Marcus answered the call. I completely bypassed all standard pleasantries. I instructed him to immediately initiate a hard, uncompromising freeze on the entire financial portfolio associated with the estate. I explicitly ordered him to lock the primary operating account, completely paralyze the emergency reserve fund, and instantly sever the merchant services gateway. The merchant gateway was the critical foundational digital infrastructure that allowed the venue to process credit cards and accept incoming payments. By severing it, I was ensuring that not a single cent could enter or exit the business ecosystem. Marcus typed rapidly on his end. I could hear the sharp clacking of his mechanical keyboard through the receiver. A few moments later, he confirmed the hard freeze was fully active. Then, I asked him for the raw access logs. I needed the exact digital footprint of the attempted theft to understand exactly how they had breached the perimeter. He read the data back to me in a calm, clinical tone. The wire transfer had not been initiated through a standard terminal or a recognized mobile application. It was pushed through an alternative digital portal using a legacy authorization token. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, perfectly recalling the comprehensive administrative audit I had conducted 6 months prior. I had specifically revoked Grant's administrative access because of his dangerous recurring habit of attempting to use business funds to cover his exorbitant personal entertainment expenses. However, he had clearly saved a ghost token on his personal hard drive, a hidden backdoor key he had been quietly holding onto for a moment exactly like this. The banking system had captured the origin Internet Protocol address. It was a static address. It routed directly back to the premium fiber optic network installed at the Mercer family mansion. The sheer, breathtaking stupidity of their execution was almost difficult to process. They had sent me a text message formally cutting me out of their lives, and then, while they assumed I was sitting in my office dissolving into a puddle of hysterical tears, they had immediately logged into the reserve account to drain the available liquidity. They honestly believed they had executed a brilliant, highly synchronized tactical strike against a weak target, but they failed to comprehend the fundamental legal nature of the money they were trying to steal. That $82,000 did not belong to Grant. It did not belong to Lorraine. It certainly did not belong to Devon's fake marketing agency. That specific reserve account was an escrow holding vehicle. It was entirely comprised of the 50% cash deposits paid by dozens of young, hopeful couples who had booked the venue for their upcoming spring and summer weddings. By attempting to funnel those specific funds into a private and third-party corporate account under the guise of digital strategy expenses, Grant and Devon had crossed a massive, terrifying legal threshold. This was no longer a messy domestic dispute about a neglected wife and an entitled husband. This was no longer a petty disagreement about who controlled the household checking account. They had just actively conspired to commit systemic wire fraud and the blatant embezzlement of client fiduciary funds. If that money had successfully left the holding account, it would have constituted a massive federal crime, carrying penalties of severe prison time. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a low, absolute register. I instructed Marcus to compile the entire data packet immediately. I demanded the raw transaction logs, the precise down-to-the-second timestamps, the device MAC identifiers, the geographical tracking data, and the full corporate registry details for the receiving account. I ordered him to heavily encrypt the entire file and transmit it directly to my secure corporate server for immediate evidence preservation. I was not merely going to stop the fraudulent transaction. I was going to weaponize the attempt. He confirmed the transmission was complete. I hung up the phone. I stood up from my desk. The air in my office felt entirely different now, charged with a lethal, electric clarity. The narrative had violently shifted. I grabbed my heavy leather briefcase, swept my car keys off the desk, and walked briskly out of the glass doors of my department. As I rode the silent, high-speed elevator down to the subterranean parking garage, the entire picture locked into perfect, horrifying focus. They did not simply want to eject me from their social circle. They wanted to violently extract me from the equation while aggressively hijacking the financial infrastructure I had spent years meticulously building. They viewed me as a disposable administrative assistant who had finally outlived her usefulness, but whose bank accounts and credit lines were still considered their rightful family property. They wanted the kingdom, but they wanted to execute the architect. I reached my vehicle, unlocked the doors, and slid into the driver's seat. I pushed the ignition button, and the engine roared to life. The drive from the towering glass skyscrapers of the downtown financial district to the sprawling, manicured estates of the outer suburbs usually took approximately 45 minutes. Today, every single minute of that journey felt like a ticking countdown timer on a highly explosive device. As I navigated the heavy afternoon traffic, aggressively merging onto the main highway, I mentally categorized every single piece of leverage I now held in my possession: the canceled vendor guarantees, the revoked commercial insurance policies, the permanently frozen merchant gateways, and now, the irrefutable, time-stamped digital proof of an attempted felony theft involving client deposits. My husband and his family were currently sitting in their opulent, heavily mortgaged living room. They were likely raising expensive crystal glasses filled with imported liquor, toasting to their newfound freedom and their newly stolen wealth. Devin was probably bragging about his technical genius, while Grant basked in the illusion of his own strength. They were completely oblivious to the fact that the digital floorboards had just been violently ripped out from beneath their feet. I gripped the leather steering wheel tightly, my knuckles turning white. The passive woman who had quietly paid their massive bills, absorbed their constant subtle insults, and managed their endless crises was dead. The person driving toward the estate was a seasoned compliance investigator holding a literal legal bomb. This was no longer a story about a broken marriage ending in a quiet, polite divorce. It was a surgical, deeply calculated unmasking. I was going to systematically drag every single one of their filthy, hidden secrets into the blinding light of day, and I was going to watch as the sheer weight of their own arrogance and greed pulled their entire fraudulent family straight down into the absolute abyss. I pulled onto the long, crushed gravel driveway of the estate. The massive wrought iron gates were wide open, welcoming anyone who cared to witness the facade. The main house loomed ahead in the twilight, a sprawling Greek revival monstrosity bathed in the warm, golden glow of strategically placed landscape lighting. I parked my vehicle off to the side, lingering near the overgrown service entrance, actively avoiding the circular motor court where Grant's imported European sports car was parked alongside Devon's pristine luxury SUV. I let myself into the building through the heavy oak side door, a secondary entrance the family rarely used, but one I preferred for its quiet discretion. The sprawling manor was eerily quiet in the grand foyer, but distinct. Animated sounds drifted down the main hallway. I heard the sharp, unmistakable clinking of expensive crystal. Raucous, unrestrained laughter echoed against the vaulted ceilings. I moved silently across the imported marble floors, my soft-soled shoes making no sound, moving toward the private parlor. It was a small, opulent room that connected the family's private living quarters directly to the venue's main reception hall. I stood completely still in the shadows of the corridor, listening to the celebration. "To the new managing partner," Devon's voice boomed from inside the parlor, thick with an unearned, sickening confidence. "A toast." With that $82,000 safely injected into the marketing matrix, we can finally spin this capital for a few weeks, completely rebrand the upper hospitality tier, and officially put Grant at the absolute helm where he belongs. "It is about time," Lorraine chimed in, her voice dripping with maternal pride and the slur of vintage Chardonnay. "This estate has always been our bloodline. Having that woman constantly looking over our shoulders, auditing my floral arrangements, policing our guest lists, it was completely stifling our true potential. We are finally free to run our own legacy." I heard Paige murmur something softly agreeable, though her voice lacked the aggressive enthusiasm of the others. Grant simply laughed, a deep, resonant sound of pure, unadulterated arrogance. They were genuinely celebrating, They firmly believed the wire transfer had seamlessly cleared the banking gateways. They thought they had outsmarted me, secured their stolen operational budget, and successfully executed a flawless corporate coup without firing a single shot. I did not storm into the parlor. I did not hurl loud accusations or dramatically reveal that the federal banking authorities were likely going to be very interested in Devon's little marketing matrix. In my profession, you learn quickly that there is absolutely no strategic value in interrupting your enemy while they are in the middle of making a fatal miscalculation. I turned away from the light of the parlor and walked silently up the grand sweeping staircase to the master suite. The bedroom was a pristine shrine to Grant's inflated ego, filled with bespoke modern furniture and framed lifestyle magazine features detailing his non-existent business ventures. I ignored the decor entirely. I walked straight to the hidden wall safe located directly behind a heavy velvet drape near the dressing room. I inputted the complex alphanumeric access code. The heavy steel door clicked open with a satisfying thud. I reached inside the cold metal box and methodically extracted the true, undeniable architecture of my life. I took my passport, my official birth certificate, and my heavily encrypted solid-state hard drive containing all my professional backups. Then, I reached deeper and pulled out the thick, fireproof manila envelopes containing the physical corporate dossiers. These were not copies. These were the original, notarized property ownership deeds and the master operating agreements. I placed the items carefully into my heavy leather tote bag. I zipped it shut. "What exactly are you doing in here?" I turned around slowly. Grant was standing in the doorway, physically blocking the exit. He held a half-empty glass of amber liquor in his right hand. The confident, triumphant smirk he had been wearing downstairs faltered slightly, replaced by a defensive, aggressive scowl. "You got the text," he said, his voice hardening as he stepped further into the room, puffing his chest out in a pathetic display of territorial dominance. "We are done. You do not just get to waltz in here and start raiding the safe. We are legally married. That means I am entitled to exactly 50% of everything you have hoarded away. I want half of the brokerage accounts, half of the liquid cash, and I'm obviously keeping the house. You can take your boring corporate wardrobe and leave." I looked at him. I really looked at him, studying the flush skin of his neck and the arrogant tilt of his chin. I did not feel a shred of anger. I felt an overwhelming, profound sense of pity. He was a small man fiercely guarding a massive castle constructed entirely of vapor. He was demanding a king's ransom without realizing he was merely the court jester. He had absolutely no idea that he had never owned a single brick of the property he was currently standing inside. 3 years ago, when the estate was drowning in toxic, high-interest debt and facing imminent foreclosure from the county tax authorities and multiple furious commercial creditors, I did not just passively pay off their balances like an obedient, wealthy spouse. I executed a highly sophisticated, entirely legal financial maneuver. I utilized a private, entirely discreet shell company called Cook Structured Holdings. Through that specific corporate entity, I systematically purchased the entirety of the distressed debt from their creditors for pennies on the dollar. I then legally transferred the physical asset, the land, the buildings, every single crystal chandelier and blade of grass, into a closed holding structure that I wholly and exclusively controlled. Grant and his mother were not the owners of White Laurel. They had not been the true owners for 36 months. Legally speaking, they were nothing more than glorified, unpaid tenants. They were permitted to reside on the premises and operate the event venue strictly under an internal, highly conditional management agreement. It was an ironclad agreement that stipulated immediate termination upon any breach of fiduciary duty, financial mismanagement, or unauthorized diversion of funds. He was standing there, holding his expensive whiskey, aggressively demanding half of an empire that I completely owned. "I am simply taking my personal identification documents," I said, my voice completely flat, devoid of any emotional inflection or defensive tone. "And I am leaving. You can have the room." I walked directly toward the door. For a brief second, I thought he might try to physically block my path, but the sheer, icy emptiness in my eyes must have deeply unsettled him. He stepped slightly to the side, his jaw tight, his knuckles white around his glass. "You will hear from my attorney first thing tomorrow," Grant sneered as I brushed past him into the hallway. "Do not think you can hide marital money from me." I did not reply. I walked gracefully down the grand staircase, out the heavy oak side door, and back into the cool evening air. I started my engine and drove away from the estate, leaving them to their cheap champagne and their grand, crumbling delusions. I drove straight to the financial district and checked into a massive, multi-room luxury suite at a premier hotel located directly in the center of downtown Charlotte. The concierge took my bags, and I ordered a simple, elegant dinner from room service. I sat by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights glitter against the dark sky, sipping sparkling water, and waiting patiently for the morning. At exactly 7 o'clock the next day, the true devastating cost of their arrogance arrived at the gates of the estate. I sat in my hotel suite, a cup of hot black coffee in my hand, watching the high-definition live feed from the venue's external security cameras on my laptop. I had retained full administrative control over the surveillance network, an oversight Devon's alleged digital genius had failed to notice. A massive, heavy-duty commercial towing vehicle, followed closely by 2 flatbed asset recovery trucks, pulled aggressively into the service courtyard behind the main catering kitchens. 4 men wearing high-visibility vests stepped out, carrying heavy steel chains and thick clipboards. The target of their early morning visit was the venue's critical logistical fleet. White Laurel relied entirely on 3 custom-outfitted refrigerated box trucks to transport high-end perishables, delicate floral arrangements, and imported seafood for their massive weekend events, along with 2 luxury passenger vans used for shuttling affluent VIP guests from the airport. Lorraine always loved to proudly point to those specific vehicles, complete with the elegant White Laurel logo emblazoned on the sides, as absolute proof of their booming operational capacity. However, the commercial lease agreements for those specific vehicles, along with the massive liability insurance policies required to legally drive them off the lot, were all held directly under the name of my holding company. I had formally canceled those policies and terminated the leases the previous afternoon. On the security feed, I watched silently as the recovery team efficiently hooked the steel cables to the front axles of the pristine refrigerated trucks. Suddenly, the back door of the kitchen flew open. Lorraine burst out into the crisp morning air, wearing a flowing silk dressing gown, her hair in total disarray. She was waving her arms frantically, yelling at the men, pointing aggressively at the trucks. Grant followed closely behind her a moment later, hastily pulling on a designer jacket, looking bewildered and completely furious. I watched the lead recovery agent calmly hand Grant a thick stack of termination paperwork. Grant stared blindly at the documents, his face contorting in pure confusion as he tried to comprehend the dense legal text and the complete, glaring absence of his own name on the master lease. Lorraine tried to physically stand in front of one of the tow trucks, a dramatic, pathetic display of misplaced authority. The agent simply pointed to his chest-mounted camera, said something that made her visibly recoil, and signaled his driver to proceed. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. The heavy diesel engines roared to life, sending thick plumes of exhaust into the pristine suburban air. One by one, the mechanical lifeblood of their hospitality business was dragged out of the driveway, the heavy tires crunching loudly against the gravel. The grand illusion was finally beginning to fracture in broad daylight. By 10 o'clock that morning, the absolute reality of my financial withdrawal crashed directly into the middle of Lorraine's carefully curated social calendar. My phone rang. I answered it on the second ring, holding the receiver slightly away from my ear. The shrill, unhinged pitch of my mother-in-law's voice immediately pierced the quiet atmosphere of my office. She was screaming so loudly that the audio distorted through the small speaker. "You thieving, manipulative little snake!" she shrieked. The premier floral wholesaler just refused to unload 3 vans full of imported white hydrangeas for the weekend gala. The premium organic caterer just bounced our deposit check for the seafood order. You stole my husband's legacy. You hijacked our family business. I kept my voice entirely level, letting her hysteria crash against a wall of pure ice. I did not steal a single thing, Lorraine. I simply stopped paying for assets that never actually belonged to you. The floral vendor operates on a credit guarantee that I personally underwrite. The catering deposits are funded by cash I inject into the accounts. You are not experiencing a theft. You are experiencing the abrupt end of a very long, very expensive charity program. You think you can just destroy my son and me? She spat, her breath hitching with genuine rage. I will come down to that pretentious corporate tower right now. I will drag Grant with me, and I will stand in the middle of your pristine lobby and tell your managing directors exactly what kind of fraudulent, controlling monster they have working for them. I will absolutely ruin your career. The lobby is open to the public, I replied simply, and hung up the phone. I knew she was not bluffing. Lorraine's entire psychological framework relied heavily on public intimidation and social theatricality. She operated under the deeply flawed assumption that if she created a loud enough scene, people would inevitably capitulate simply to avoid the embarrassment. She fundamentally misunderstood the environment of Harrogate Assurance. We did not cower from aggressive audits. We initiated them. I calmly opened my desk drawer and retrieved a slim black leather portfolio. Inside, I placed a certified copy of the master property deed, the executed management contract bearing both Grant and Lorraine's legally binding signatures, and a neatly printed ledger documenting every single past due debt I had quietly settled on their behalf over the last 3 years. I smoothed my tailored blazer and waited. 45 minutes later, the internal security line on my desk chimed. The head of building security, a retired military intelligence officer named Thomas, informed me that a highly agitated woman and a very red-faced man were currently causing a significant disturbance at the main reception desk, loudly demanding to see the director of compliance. I took the elevator down to the ground floor. The main lobby of Harrogate Assurance is a cavernous, intimidating expanse of polished white marble, brushed steel, and floor-to-ceiling soundproof glass. It is a space designed specifically to project immense institutional wealth and absolute control. It is not a place that tolerates chaotic emotional outbursts. As the elevator doors slid open, the sound of Lorraine's voice echoed harshly off the stone walls. She was standing dead center in the lobby, wearing a completely inappropriate designer silk dress, violently pointing a finger at the stoic receptionist. Grant stood slightly behind her, shifting his weight nervously from foot to foot, looking distinctly like a man who was rapidly realizing he had made a catastrophic tactical error but was too cowardly to stop it. "She is a criminal!" Lorraine announced loudly, making sure her voice carried to the executives and high-net-worth clients waiting near the elevator banks. "She manipulated my son. She fraudulently seized our ancestral estate and locked us out of our own business accounts." I walked slowly across the polished floor. The sharp click of my heels drew the attention of the surrounding crowd. Conversations halted. People turned to watch. I did not rush. I approached Thomas, who was standing a few feet away from the desk, his arms crossed over his chest, closely monitoring the situation with 2 uniformed guards. "Good morning, Thomas," I said, my voice projecting clearly but calmly. Lorraine spun around, her face contorted in a mask of pure, vicious triumph. "There she is. Tell them. Brianna, tell them how you stole White Laurel." I completely ignored her. I handed the slim black portfolio directly to Thomas. "Thomas, these individuals are loudly alleging corporate fraud and property theft on our premises. To ensure the complete legal protection of this firm, I would like you to review these documents. The first page is the certified county registration proving that I am the sole, absolute legal owner of the property they are referring to. The second page is their signed, conditional tenancy and management agreement. The final pages are undeniable proof of the massive financial liabilities I rescued them from." Thomas opened the portfolio. He spent exactly 60 seconds scanning the notarized stamps, the bold legal signatures, and the stark financial figures. He closed the folder and handed it back to me. He then turned his imposing solid frame toward Lorraine and Grant. "Madam," Thomas said, his voice possessing the heavy, immovable weight of absolute authority. "According to these legally binding documents, you possess absolutely no ownership stake or legal claim to the property in question. Furthermore, you are currently trespassing on private corporate property and actively creating a hostile disturbance. You will leave this building immediately, or my officers will physically escort you to the sidewalk, and we will file formal police charges for public harassment." Lorraine's jaw dropped. The vibrant, angry color rapidly drained from her face, leaving her looking sallow and suddenly very old. She looked wildly around the cavernous lobby. She expected gasps of sympathy from the crowd. She expected people to rally to the defense of a wronged matriarch. Instead, she was met with a wall of cold, unblinking, corporate disdain. Well-dressed professionals looked at her not with pity, but with profound, uncomfortable disgust. This was the exact moment her entire reality shattered. For her entire adult life, Lorraine had commanded the dining room table. She had ruled the local country club patio through sheer volume and aggressive social maneuvering. But here, standing on the gleaming, unforgiving marble floor of a multi-billion-dollar financial institution, her imaginary social power evaporated instantly. She was nothing more than a loud, disruptive, financially illiterate woman making a fool of herself in public. Grant grabbed her arm, his face burning with a fiery, humiliating red flush. He practically dragged his mother toward the revolving glass doors. They stumbled out onto the busy downtown sidewalk, completely stripped of their dignity, cast out into the harsh midday sun. I watched them go, feeling nothing but a cool, refreshing breeze from the air conditioning vents. I returned to my office and sat back down at my desk. Before I could even open my email client, my secondary monitor flashed with a priority alert from the remote management software installed at the venue. While Lorraine and Grant had been busy putting on a disastrous theatrical performance in my lobby, the real panic was quietly unfolding behind closed doors back at the estate. I clicked the notification and opened the internal security camera feed for the venue's back office suite. The high-definition video displayed Devon pacing frantically back and forth across the small room. He was holding his mobile phone tightly against his ear, his usually perfectly styled hair looking ruffled and damp with sweat. He was aggressively pounding his fist against the edge of the wooden desk. Next to the video feed, the digital merchant ledger updated in real time. Devon had just attempted to forcefully refresh the balance of his fake marketing agency's receiving account for the 15th time in the last 2 hours. He was desperately waiting for the $82,000 to land. He was waiting for the stolen client deposits to materialize so he could finally execute whatever cowardly exit strategy he had planned. But the numbers on the screen stubbornly remained at zero. The money had never moved. It had never even left the staging area. The hard freeze I had initiated with the fraud department was absolute and impenetrable. I watched the screen as Devon violently hurled his phone against the leather sofa, burying his face in his hands. He finally realized that the bank vault was entirely sealed, the funds were completely locked, and the massive federal crime he had just attempted had yielded absolutely zero payout. The trap had not just closed around them, it had permanently locked. The quiet isolation of my hotel suite provided the perfect sterile laboratory to dissect the rotting corpse of their finances. I had my heavily encrypted laptop connected to the secure cloud servers, my secondary monitor displaying the recovered master ledgers, and a pot of dark roast coffee keeping my pulse steady. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the first buried explosive detonated. It arrived via a highly prioritized email from my personal certified public accountant. The subject line indicated a critical discrepancy regarding a joint federal tax return. I opened the attachment. According to the Internal Revenue Service portal, a comprehensive joint filing had been submitted and fully processed exactly 4 months prior. I stared at the digital signature line. It bore my name, but the cryptographic key was entirely wrong. I had not signed this document. I had not even seen it. I scrolled down to the itemized deductions, and the sheer audacity of my husband's stupidity practically leaped off the high-resolution screen. Grant had brazenly attached a massive schedule of corporate losses to his fabricated consulting shell company. He had classified tens of thousands of dollars in extravagant restaurant dinners, luxury car leases, and high-end resort stays as legitimate hospitality business development expenses. By artificially inflating his corporate losses and marrying them to my substantial executive salary, he had successfully manipulated the tax algorithm to wipe out our liability and trigger an illegal, massive federal refund of roughly $45,000. He had forged my digital signature to commit federal tax fraud. I did not pause to process the betrayal. Betrayal is an emotion, and I was currently operating strictly as a forensic mechanism. I immediately opened a direct channel to my accountant. Within 15 minutes, I had initiated a comprehensive innocent spouse relief petition. I digitally bundled my personal annual wage statements, my independent bank routing histories, and the geographical tracking data proving my physical device was in a different state on the exact day the fraudulent return was submitted. I officially severed my tax liability from his, effectively painting a massive red target directly on Grant's back for an impending, devastating federal audit. That single discovery prompted me to dig much deeper into the archived accounting folders on my stolen hard drive. If Grant was bold enough to defraud the federal government, Lorraine's financial sins were undoubtedly hiding just beneath the surface of her carefully manicured social image. I opened the master ledger for the North Quill Hospitality Scholarship Fund. For the past 7 years, Lorraine had tirelessly promoted the North Quill Fund as her late husband's philanthropic legacy. She utilized the charity as her primary social weapon, hosting lavish annual luncheons and tearfully soliciting substantial donations from wealthy local business owners, prominent community leaders, and distant relatives. The stated mission was noble, providing full tuition grants for underprivileged local youth to attend prestigious culinary and hospitality management academies. I ran a simple chronological query on the outbound cash flow. The results were sickening. There were absolutely no tuition checks, there were no grants, no educational stipends, and no textbook reimbursements. The entire charitable foundation was a completely hollow, cynical shell. Instead, I tracked the agonizingly steady bleed of donor money flowing directly into Lorraine's personal lifestyle maintenance. A $5,000 donation from a local bank executive had been immediately routed to pay off her severely delinquent account at an exclusive cosmetic dermatology clinic. A generous endowment from a regional produce supplier had been siphoned to cover her monthly premium membership dues at the private country club. The scholarship fund had essentially functioned as Lorraine's private slush fund, financing her imported silk evening gowns, her regular therapeutic spa retreats, and the heavily catered, ostentatious dinner parties she threw to maintain her illusion of generational wealth. She had not just mismanaged funds, she had actively, systematically stolen from a registered charity under the guise of honoring a grieving widow's noble cause. Every single file I opened was another felony waiting to be prosecuted. It was time to bring in the heavy artillery. I placed a call to Mara Ellison. Mara was widely considered the most ruthless, terrifyingly efficient high-asset divorce attorney in the state. She did not handle messy emotional mediations. She specialized in total financial evisceration. I hired her on the spot, transferring a substantial retainer fee, and immediately established 3 distinct legal fronts: the dissolution of the marriage, the civil prosecution of the attempted embezzlement, and a rapidly expanding portfolio for severe financial fraud. As I was concluding my video conference with Mara, my personal cell phone began vibrating aggressively against the desk. Notifications from various social networking platforms were pouring in by the dozen, lighting up the screen in a rapid, continuous wave. I opened the primary application. Lorraine had decided to go to war in the only arena she actually understood, the court of public opinion. She had posted a sprawling, heavily dramatized, multi-paragraph manifesto on her public profile. It was accompanied by a carefully selected, deeply melancholic photograph of herself standing mournfully in front of the grand iron gates of White Laurel. The narrative she spun was a masterpiece of manipulative fiction. She painted herself as the vulnerable, desperately grieving widow, fiercely trying to protect her family's sacred historical legacy from a heartless, hyper-controlling, financially abusive daughter-in-law. She explicitly accused me of seizing their ancestral home through obscure corporate loopholes, locking her out of her own life's work, and leaving her son entirely destitute on the street. The response from her affluent, completely uninformed social circle was instantaneous and vitriolic. The comment section rapidly filled with hundreds of outraged messages from country club wives and local socialites. They called me a corporate vulture. They labeled me a gold digger who had finally shown her true colors. Some even sent highly aggressive, threatening direct messages to my private inbox, promising to ensure I was blacklisted from every respectable establishment in the city. A lesser person might have immediately drafted a frantic, defensive rebuttal. A lesser person might have logged on to desperately scream the truth into the void, trying to convince a mob of strangers about the forged tax returns and the looted charity funds. I did absolutely nothing of the sort. I sat perfectly still in the quiet hum of the hotel air conditioning. I simply opened a piece of specialized forensic archiving software. With slow, deliberate keystrokes, I captured the entire digital landscape. I securely preserved the original post, mapping the exact timestamp and server origination data. I archived every single defamatory comment, cross-referencing the names against the donor list for the looted scholarship fund. I captured high-resolution screenshots of every threatening message sent to my inbox. Lorraine believed she was successfully orchestrating a brilliant public relations campaign to destroy my social standing and force me into a quiet, embarrassed submission. She had no idea she was actually hand-delivering a perfectly documented, irrefutable case for severe defamation and tortious interference directly to my legal team. I was not going to fight her in the meaningless, chaotic mud of a social media comment section. I was going to let her continue digging her own grave in public, completely unaware that every single word she typed was rapidly becoming weaponized civil evidence that would eventually strip away the very last remaining fragments of her fraudulent life. The text message arrived at exactly 9 in the morning on Thursday. It was not from my mother-in-law or my estranged husband. It was from Paige, Grant's younger sister. The message was brief and lacked the usual haughty punctuation the Mercer family favored. It simply read that things were collapsing much faster than she had anticipated, and she begged me to meet her at a busy artisan coffee shop situated 2 blocks away from the Harrogate Assurance Building. I arrived exactly 5 minutes early and secured a small, round table near the back, entirely out of the direct line of sight from the street. The cafe was loud, filled with the aggressive hum of espresso machines and the dense, overlapping chatter of the morning financial district rush. It was the perfect environment for a conversation that required absolute discretion. Paige walked through the glass doors 10 minutes later, and the physical deterioration was genuinely startling. The woman who normally spent 3 hours every single morning perfecting a look of effortless, wealthy suburban superiority was entirely gone. Her designer trench coat was wrinkled, her blonde hair was pulled back into a messy, uneven knot, and her skin possessed a pale, sickly translucence. She looked like a hostage who had just realized the ransom was never going to be paid. She sat down across from me, gripping the edge of the table with white knuckles. She did not order a drink. Devin told me the primary accounts were locked because the holding bank initiated a routine corporate growth audit, Paige whispered, her voice trembling slightly, barely audible over the hiss of the milk steamer. He said they do it all the time when a venue scales up marketing operations rapidly. He promised me the freeze would be lifted in 48 hours. I looked at her, maintaining a perfectly neutral expression. And you do not believe him anymore. I cannot, she said, her eyes darting nervously around the crowded room. He did not sleep at all last night. He just paced the floor of his home office, drinking straight gin and screaming at his phone. He keeps staring at his briefcase. Brianna, what is actually happening? He said he was saving White Laurel. I reached into my structured leather tote bag and retrieved a single sheet of heavy stock paper. It was not a complicated legal document. It was a streamlined, ruthlessly clear cash flow diagram that I had generated from the captured venue ledgers. I slid it across the wooden table toward her. Devin never invested a single dime into the estate. Paige, I explained, keeping my tone low and steady, allowing the truth to seep into the air between us like an invisible, toxic gas. He did not inject capital. He engineered a massive, illegal shell game. He used the venue's existing vendor credit lines to shield his own failing business, and he actively cannibalized the incoming cash deposits from future bridal clients to systematically pay down his personal, high-interest gambling debts. He was bleeding the venue entirely dry under the guise of digital marketing expansion. Paige stared at the geometric lines and the staggering financial figures printed on the page. I watched her throat swallow hard. But there is a secondary layer to his strategy, I continued, withdrawing a second sheet of paper from my bag. A man running a Ponzi scheme eventually realizes the music is about to stop. Devin knew the deposit well was running completely dry, so he prepared an exit strategy. This is a highly detailed forensic breakdown of his personal credit card activity over the last 14 days. I pointed to a cluster of highlighted transactions near the bottom of the page. 4 days ago, Devin paid a premium luxury travel concierge an exorbitant sum for 2 one-way first-class transatlantic boarding passes departing from Atlanta to Lisbon, Portugal. The flight leaves this coming Sunday evening. Paige's breath hitched. Lisbon? But we never discussed Portugal. And why 2 tickets? I cannot just leave. You were never going to Lisbon, I said quietly. I moved my finger to the final set of highlighted charges. Over the past 3 months, Devin has maintained a steady stream of luxury purchases, diamond jewelry from an independent boutique downtown, high-end lingerie, multiple weekend stays at a boutique hotel in Charleston. The recipient of these items is an independent real estate agent who operates strictly in the downtown corridor. Her name is not Paige. The silence that fell over our small table was absolute, completely isolating us from the noisy chaos of the coffee shop. I watched the final structural pillars of Paige's reality disintegrate. The betrayal did not arrive with a dramatic explosion. It settled over her like a suffocating, heavy blanket of ice. She finally understood. Her husband was not the brilliant savior of the Mercer family legacy. He was a cowardly parasite who had planned to siphon the very last drops of liquidity from her family's accounts and flee the continent with his mistress, leaving Paige to face the devastating federal fallout alone. A single tear slipped down her pale cheek, dropping silently onto the cash flow diagram. When she finally looked up at me, the fear in her eyes had been entirely replaced by a desperate, cold clarity. "He never lets it out of his sight," she whispered, her voice suddenly entirely devoid of emotion. "The dark brown leather briefcase, he takes it into the bathroom with him. He sleeps with it on the floor right next to his side of the bed. I saw inside it once when he left it unlocked for exactly 2 seconds. I leaned in slightly. "What is in the briefcase, Paige?" "A secondary set of accounting ledgers," she replied quickly, the words spilling out in a rush of pure self-preservation. "Physical composition notebooks. He tracks every single diverted dollar by hand because he does not trust the digital footprint. He also keeps the fabricated vendor contracts in there, the ones he used to justify the outbound wire transfers. And there is a heavy, encrypted titanium flash drive. He told me it contained his proprietary marketing algorithms, but I know he uses it to access an offshore holding account. This was the exact intelligence I needed. The digital footprint was solid, but physical. Handwritten double ledgers were the absolute holy grail for a commercial fraud prosecution. Paige wiped her face aggressively with the back of her hand. "There is something else. Something Grant did." I remained perfectly still. "Tell me. Last night, after Lorraine came back from your office completely hysterical, Grant locked himself in the library," Paige said, her eyes wide with lingering shock. "I walked past the door and heard him on the phone with a commercial lending broker. He was panicking about the frozen merchant accounts. Brianna. He applied for a massive, unsecured corporate line of credit to bridge the venue's operating gap." I narrowed my eyes. "Grant has 0 verifiable income and a credit score that barely registers." No legitimate commercial broker would ever underwrite an unsecured loan for him. He did not use his own financial profile, Paige confessed, her voice dropping to a frantic whisper. He used yours. I heard him reading your exact Social Security identification digits, your annual executive salary figures, and your previous residential addresses over the phone. He submitted the application naming you as the primary, unconditional financial guarantor. He thinks that because you are still legally married, he has the absolute right to leverage your financial identity to save his business without requiring your physical signature. The air in my lungs turned completely to frost. Grant had just crossed the final, unforgivable boundary. The fraudulent joint tax return was a pathetic attempt to steal from the government. But actively impersonating me to secure high-yield commercial debt was a direct, violent assault on my entire professional existence. He had abandoned the realm of a messy, contested divorce and sprinted directly into the jurisdiction of severe, premeditated identity theft. I did not panic. I simply nodded, thanking Paige for the information, and stood up from the table. I left her sitting there with the undeniable proof of her husband's impending desertion. I walked briskly out of the coffee shop, pulled my encrypted phone from my coat pocket, and immediately dialed the direct emergency line for the 3 major national credit reporting bureaus. Within exactly 4 minutes, standing on the bustling sidewalk of the financial district, I initiated a total, impenetrable security freeze on my entire personal credit profile. Any incoming inquiry from a lending institution would instantly trigger a hard rejection and generate an automated fraud alert. I then contacted my internal fraud division at Harrogate Assurance, formally transferring the details of the fraudulent application attempt to the investigative team. Grant believed he was cleverly outmaneuvering my financial blockade. He did not realize he had just handed me the precise legal instrument required to put him in a federal holding cell. The Mercer family was rapidly discovering that survival required intelligence, and they had just entirely run out of their supply. By Friday morning, the operational reality of my financial blockade had transformed the atmosphere at the estate into a suffocating pressure cooker. Through the remote venue management software still active on my secure monitor, I watched the logistical collapse unfold in real time. It started with the high-end linen supplier. A massive delivery truck arrived at the service gates, but the driver refused to unload a single tablecloth. The automatic verification system had flagged the venue's commercial liability insurance as entirely void, and the system automatically rejected their outstanding invoice from the previous month. The driver simply put his vehicle in reverse and drove away, leaving Grant screaming empty threats into his cell phone in the middle of the empty driveway. Then, the incoming calls began. The frozen reserve fund meant that automated deposit confirmations for upcoming spring weddings were bouncing back to the clients. Frantic brides and furious fathers-in-law began lighting up the estate's main phone lines, aggressively demanding the immediate return of their substantial cash retainers. I watched the internal office camera feed as Grant frantically unplugged the main telephone receiver from the wall, entirely incapable of explaining to his clients that their money was currently locked behind a federal fraud investigation. They were drowning, and the water level was rising by the hour. Logic dictates that a business in the midst of total catastrophic failure should immediately cease operations. Lorraine, however, operated in a completely alternate reality constructed entirely of sheer social vanity. Despite the severe lack of staff, vendors, and operating capital, she absolutely refused to cancel the Winter Lantern benefit scheduled for the following evening. This annual charity gala was her masterpiece, her primary vehicle for extracting adoration from the local elite. Canceling it would be a public admission of defeat. More dangerously, she viewed the upcoming gala as the perfect, highly public stage to force my hand. She genuinely believed that if she backed me into a corner surrounded by wealthy donors and influential socialites, my corporate conditioning would force me to quietly capitulate simply to avoid a scandalous scene. In her frantic, desperate attempts to scrounge up viable table decorations from the basement storage archives, Lorraine stumbled across something she believed was far more valuable than silver centerpieces. Tucked away inside a forgotten cardboard box was my old, heavy silver laptop. It was a machine I had officially retired 2 years ago. To a woman whose entire understanding of the corporate world was based on daytime television dramas, finding an executive's discarded computer in a dusty basement was akin to unearthing a buried treasure chest of devastating blackmail material. She assumed I had carelessly left behind a machine loaded with dirty corporate secrets, illicit financial ledgers, and proof of my own illegal activities. Security footage from the driveway showed Lorraine practically sprinting to her car with the silver device clutched tightly to her chest. She drove directly to a cheap strip mall electronics repair shop located 3 towns over. She handed the teenage technician $200 in cash to completely bypass the login screen and strip the administrative password. When she finally booted up the machine in the passenger seat of her car, her eyes must have widened with absolute triumphant glee. Sitting right there on the pristine desktop background were several neatly organized folders. They bore incredibly provocative titles like Offshore Tax Structures, Cayman Holding Entities, and Unreported Income Ledgers. She did not bother to actually verify the contents or question why a senior compliance director would leave such blatantly labeled evidence lying around. She saw exactly what she desperately wanted to see: the ultimate weapon to destroy me. At exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a new message landed in my personal inbox. It was flagged with high importance. The subject line simply read that the game was over. I opened the email and read through Lorraine's venomous, triumphant prose. It was a textbook, albeit highly amateurish, extortion demand. She claimed to have full possession of my highly confidential corporate files and threatened to immediately forward the entire hard drive to the Internal Revenue Service, the State Banking Commission, and the Managing Board of Harrogate Assurance. She presented her non-negotiable terms. I was to immediately withdraw all legal complaints, officially sign over total legal control of the estate to Grant, and wire the locked $82,000 into their personal checking account before the first guest arrived at the Winter Lantern benefit tomorrow night. If I failed to comply, she would press send and absolutely ruin my professional life forever. I sat back in my plush hotel chair and allowed a genuine, relaxed smile to cross my face for the first time in days. Lorraine thought she was playing an aggressive game of chess, but she was barely grasping the concept of checkers. That silver laptop was not a careless oversight. It was a highly specialized, deliberately engineered honeypot. In the cybersecurity intelligence field, a honeypot is a decoy system purposely designed to be highly attractive to malicious actors, while secretly monitoring and logging their every single move. The intimidating folders on the desktop contained absolutely nothing but randomly generated, useless data text files. However, the exact second that strip mall technician bypassed the lock screen, the machine's hidden secondary protocol silently activated. It had quietly pinged a secure server, establishing a hidden digital tether. I opened my forensic tracking dashboard. The software had already captured a staggering amount of data. It recorded the exact geographic coordinates of the repair shop, the precise timestamp of the unauthorized access, and the continuous location tracking data mapping Lorraine's drive back to the estate. More importantly, it had captured the raw headers and the original Internet Protocol routing data from the very email she had just sent me. She had not found leverage. She had just documented her own commission of a severe federal felony. Extortion across state digital lines carries a mandatory prison sentence. I highlighted the entire data packet, meticulously bundled the raw email headers, the location logs, and the threatening message itself into a highly secure encrypted file. I bypassed local law enforcement entirely and transmitted the dossier directly to the principal contact at the Federal Financial Crimes Investigative Unit, a man I had worked alongside during several major corporate fraud audits. The trap was now fully armed and legally binding. I then opened a blank reply to Lorraine's email. I kept my response incredibly brief, matching her arrogant tone with a perfectly crafted illusion of defeated surrender. I typed that she had won. I told her I would not risk my entire corporate career over a piece of suburban real estate. I promised I would arrive at the Winter Lantern benefit tomorrow evening, wearing a nice dress, and I would sign whatever paperwork they required to make this entire nightmare go away quietly. I hit send. I closed my laptop. They believed they had finally cornered the prey, entirely unaware that the walls of the slaughterhouse were already locking into place right behind them. Saturday morning arrived with the sterile, uncompromising clarity of a surgical operating theater. I did not wake up feeling anxious or hesitant. I woke up with the precise, methodical energy of an executioner verifying the sharpness of the blade. At exactly 9 o'clock, my attorney, Mara Ellison, arrived at my hotel suite, accompanied by the senior director of the premier commercial property management firm in the city. We sat around the heavy mahogany dining table, drinking black coffee and finalizing the absolute destruction of the Mercer family legacy. Mara slid a thick, officially stamped document across the polished wood. It was the formalized writ of possession. The legal order was completely unassailable, grounded in years of documented financial delinquency, severe fiduciary breach, and the recently uncovered operational fraud. The property management director confirmed that a full tactical transition team, complete with commercial locksmiths and off-duty law enforcement officers, was scheduled to breach the estate gates later that evening. Once they departed, I turned my attention to the physical architecture of my revenge. I spent 3 hours meticulously compiling individual presentation dossiers. I used heavy, matte black leather binders, the kind utilized for high-level corporate board meetings. Inside each binder, I structured the narrative of their demise with devastating, undeniable clarity. Section 1 contained the raw banking ledgers proving the complete, systematic gutting of the North Quill Scholarship Fund. Section 2 detailed Devon's desperate, illegal rotation of the bridal client cash deposits. Section 3 showcased the fabricated commercial credit application bearing my stolen Social Security identification. Section 4 held the fraudulent joint tax return. The final section, the absolute killing blow, contained a high-resolution printout of Lorraine's amateurish extortion email, complete with the digital routing data that guaranteed her federal indictment. I assembled 12 identical binders. Before I began my physical preparations for the evening, I made 3 highly targeted phone calls. I reached out directly to the primary, high-net-worth philanthropists who had historically funded Lorraine's vanity projects. I did not sound frantic. I sounded like a trusted financial advisor offering a quiet, insider warning. I simply suggested that when they arrived at the gala tonight, they should politely wait to open the donation envelopes until after they had a clear understanding of where their previous contributions had actually vanished. I planted the seed of doubt, ensuring the audience would be primed for the impending revelation. The physical preparation for the evening was not an act of vanity. It was the donning of psychological armor. I chose my wardrobe with the exact same ruthless calculation I applied to forensic accounting. I selected a tailored, deep crimson silk dress that fell elegantly just below the knee, a color that commanded absolute attention in a room full of muted winter tones. Over it, I wore a sharply structured, razor-cut black blazer. The silhouette was intimidating, modern, and entirely devoid of the soft, compliant femininity they had always expected from me. I pulled my hair back into a severe, flawless twist and applied a dark, matte red lipstick. When I looked in the mirror, I did not see a grieving, discarded wife. I saw a corporate predator ready to close the trap. The Winter Lantern benefit was designed to be Lorraine's ultimate theatrical masterpiece, a desperate, sparkling illusion of untouchable social grace. When I arrived at the estate at exactly 8:30 in the evening, deliberately an hour and a half late to maximize the psychological disruption of my entrance, the facade was in full swing. The grand driveway was lined with hundreds of flickering candles enclosed in frosted glass lanterns. Inside the main reception hall, crisp white linen tablecloths draped across the dining rounds, and a smooth jazz quartet played softly in the corner. Lorraine had somehow managed to scrounge together enough floral centerpieces and cheap champagne to maintain the visual illusion of wealth, greeting her wealthy guests with fake, aristocratic kisses on the cheek and shrill, forced laughter. I stood in the shadowed archway of the grand hall for a long moment, simply observing the targets. Grant was standing near the main bar, wearing a pristine, custom-tailored tuxedo that I had paid for 2 years ago. He was holding a crystal tumbler of scotch, laughing loudly at a joke told by a local politician, puffing his chest out as if he were merely hours away from officially inheriting a massive, unencumbered empire. He looked incredibly handsome and entirely hollow. Across the room, Devon stood near the secondary exit doors. His demeanor was completely different. The slick, arrogant marketing guru was gone. He looked rigid, his shoulders incredibly tense inside his suit jacket. Every few minutes, he would discreetly pull back his left cuff to check the heavy gold watch on his wrist, calculating the exact minutes remaining before he needed to sprint to the airport to catch his first-class flight to Lisbon. His dark brown leather briefcase, the physical container of his impending doom, was resting securely against his right leg. He never moved more than a few inches away from it. And then there was Paige. She was seated alone at the head family table, completely still. She wore a pale blue evening gown that made her skin look like translucent parchment. She held a glass of untouched water, her eyes fixed in a dead, unblinking stare directly on Devon's leather briefcase. She knew exactly what was inside it. She knew about the offshore accounts, the forged vendor contracts, and the mistress waiting in the departure lounge. She looked like a ghost haunting her own family's funeral. I took a slow, deep breath, adjusting the heavy strap of the large leather tote bag containing the 12 black dossiers. I stepped out of the shadows and walked directly into the center of the brightly lit room. The effect was immediate. The soft murmur of polite conversation began to die off, spreading outward from my location like a wave of sudden, freezing water. Heads turned, eyes widened. The jazz quartet seemed to falter for a fraction of a second as the bass player noticed the sudden shift in the room's energy. I did not look at the guests. I kept my gaze locked entirely on the head table. My crimson dress cut through the sea of boring black and silver gowns like a siren. I was not there to beg for my marriage. I was not there to quietly negotiate terms in a back hallway to avoid a public scene. Lorraine noticed me first. Her fake smile froze instantly, her eyes widening with a mixture of sheer terror and triumphant validation. She genuinely believed my presence meant her extortion attempt had worked perfectly. She immediately grabbed Grant's arm, pointing a manicured finger in my direction. Grant turned, his arrogant smirk locking into place as he watched me approach the head table. He hastily set his scotch down and straightened his bow tie, puffing himself up to play the role of the generous, victorious conqueror welcoming the defeated peasant. I reached the table and stopped, standing tall, looking down at him. The silence in the immediate vicinity was absolute. Every single wealthy donor and socialite seated at the adjacent tables had stopped eating, leaning in slightly, desperate to witness the drama unfold. Grant did not say a single word. He simply reached into the inner breast pocket of his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a thick, legally bound document. It was the final settlement agreement, undoubtedly drafted by Devon's panicked, chaotic legal logic. Grant slid the heavy stack of papers smoothly across the crisp white tablecloth until it rested directly in front of me. He placed a heavy gold-plated fountain pen on top of it. "It is over, Brianna," Grant said, his voice pitched just loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear, dripping with condescension. "Sign the transfer of control. Release the $82,000 from the operating accounts. Do exactly what is outlined in the document, and my mother will permanently delete the highly sensitive corporate files she recovered from your personal laptop. You can walk away from our property tonight with whatever remains of your career intact." He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest, waiting for me to pick up the pen and surrender my entire life. I picked up the heavy, gold-plated fountain pen. I uncapped it with a deliberate, sharp twist. I lowered my hand until the metallic nib hovered exactly a fraction of an inch above the thick black signature line printed on the final page of their ridiculous settlement document. The entire head table held its collective breath. Grant's arrogant smirk widened, his eyes gleaming with the absolute certainty of his unearned victory. Lorraine visibly relaxed her tense shoulders, releasing a long, shaky exhale that smelled faintly of aged wine and desperation. The surrounding tables, populated by the wealthiest and most influential citizens of the city, fell completely silent. The soft, rhythmic brushing of the jazz drummer's snares seemed to echo loudly in the cavernous, heavily decorated reception hall. They all believed they were witnessing the quiet, inevitable capitulation of a beaten woman. They thought I was finally surrendering the keys to the kingdom. I kept the pen suspended in the air for 5 full seconds. Then, I slowly capped the pen. The sharp click of the metal snapping into place sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. I have spent my entire professional career analyzing legally binding agreements, I said, my voice perfectly level, carrying effortlessly across the tense silence of the dining floor. And I never signed my name to a fraudulent document. I dropped the pen. It clattered against the fine crystal water glasses. Before Grant could even process the sudden shift in my tone, I reached down and unzipped my heavy leather tote bag. I pulled out the 12 matte black corporate dossiers I had meticulously assembled that morning. I completely ignored my husband. I walked directly past the head table and moved into the crowd of seated guests. I handed the first heavy binder to the chief executive officer of the regional commercial bank, a man who had personally written massive donation checks to the Mercer family for over half a decade. I handed the second binder to the elderly, heavily jeweled matriarch of a prominent local real estate dynasty. I deliberately placed the next 2 dossiers on the table occupied by the parents of 2 young brides who were currently planning their massive spring weddings at the estate. I distributed the remaining copies to the various seated members of the charity fundraising board. "What in the world are you doing?" Grant barked, his voice cracking slightly as he stumbled forward, nearly knocking over his chair. "Security, get her out of here." There was no security. I had canceled their employment contracts 2 days ago. I turned to face the room, standing perfectly straight in my crimson dress. The jazz quartet stopped playing entirely. The silence was absolute, heavy, and pregnant with incoming disaster. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, projecting my voice with the cold, undeniable authority of a lead investigator presenting findings to a grand jury. "I invite those of you holding a dossier to immediately open it to Section 1. It is clearly labeled as the North Quill Hospitality Scholarship Fund." I heard the heavy rustle of thick paper as several wealthy guests aggressively flipped open the binders. "For the past 7 years," I continued, making direct eye contact with the regional bank executive, "you have written substantial tax-deductible checks to this foundation. You were repeatedly assured that your generosity was funding full educational tuitions for underprivileged youth. I urge you to look at the highlighted federal banking ledgers in front of you. Every single dollar you donated was instantly diverted. Your money did not buy textbooks or culinary equipment. Your charitable contributions were systematically siphoned by Lorraine Mercer to pay her delinquent accounts at exclusive cosmetic dermatology clinics, to fund her premium country club memberships, and to purchase the very evening gown she is currently wearing." The room detonated. The polite, hushed atmosphere of upper-class society vanished in a split second, replaced by the visceral, chaotic roar of profound betrayal. The banking executive stood up violently, his face flushing a deep, dangerous purple, pointing a trembling finger directly at Lorraine. An elderly board member gasped loudly, clutching her chest. Lorraine stumbled backward, her face completely drained of color. She knocked against the edge of the head table, sending a towering crystal vase of white hydrangeas crashing to the hardwood floor. Water and shattered glass exploding outward. I did not give them a single moment to recover. I raised my voice, cutting sharply through the rising shouts of the furious donors. "Please turn to Section 2, I commanded. The parents of the brides flipped the pages, their hands shaking. The financial rot extends far beyond the charity. Devon Price and Grant Mercer have been actively operating a massive commercial shell game. For those of you who have paid the 50% cash retainers for your upcoming spring and summer weddings, I advise you to look at the outbound wire transfer logs. Your deposits no longer exist. They were illegally rotated out of the secure escrow accounts to cover Devon's staggering personal debt liabilities and to fabricate commercial vendor credit lines. They stole your money to keep the lights on." A woman near the front table let out a piercing, horrified scream. Her husband lunged forward toward the head table, his fists clenched, only to be physically restrained by two other guests. The elegant winter lantern benefit had rapidly devolved into a vicious, unmanageable mob. Grant was hyperventilating, his custom tuxedo suddenly looking like a poorly fitted costume. He backed away from the furious crowd, his eyes darting frantically around the room, desperately looking for an escape route. Devon, however, remained entirely silent. He slowly began to slide his right foot backward, inching his way toward the secondary exit doors that led through the dark catering kitchens to the rear service alley. He was abandoning the ship. Then, a sharp, terrible sound cut through the chaos. It was the sound of a wooden chair scraping violently against the floorboards. Paige stood up. Her pale blue dress hung loosely on her thin frame, but her posture was rigid with absolute, furious clarity. She did not look at her mother or her brother. She looked directly at her husband. "He is not going to fix this," Paige said. Her voice trembled violently, but the sheer volume and conviction carried her words across the chaotic room. "He never planned to save my family." Devon booked a one-way first-class transatlantic flight to Lisbon. It departs in exactly 3 hours. He was planning to drain whatever cash remained in the accounts and abandon all of us here tonight to face the federal authorities. The crowd gasped again. Devon froze in his tracks, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated terror as his own wife delivered the fatal strike to his character. Lorraine completely snapped. Driven mad by the instantaneous evaporation of her entire social universe, she reached into her beaded silver clutch and ripped out her smartphone. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely unlock the screen. "I am sending it!" Lorraine screamed, her voice a hysterical, broken shriek that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "I am sending all of your illegal offshore tax files right now. I will forward them to every single regulatory board and financial commission in the state. You brought this destruction on yourself." I looked at her desperate, sweating face and offered a calm, genuine smile. "Pressing send on an extortion demand is the most foolish signature you could ever provide. Lorraine," right on cue, the massive, heavy double doors of the main entrance hall swung open with a resounding crash. The frigid winter wind swept into the room, instantly blowing out dozens of the decorative candles. Two imposing figures wearing dark, sharply tailored suits stepped into the light of the reception hall. The taller of the two men reached into his jacket pocket, withdrew a leather wallet, and flipped it open to reveal a heavy gold badge. "Lorraine Mercer," the federal financial investigator announced, his booming, authoritative voice instantly silencing the screaming donors and terrified guests. He was accompanied by a senior enforcement officer from the State Charity Fraud Division. "We have already received the digital transmission of your email. We possess the raw routing headers, the unauthorized access logs, and the exact geographic coordinates proving your extortion attempt. Step away from the device." Total, paralyzing shock completely overtook the Mercer family. Lorraine dropped her phone. It clattered uselessly against the hardwood floor. Grant sank slowly to his knees, burying his face in his hands, finally comprehending the absolute magnitude of his destruction. In the corner of the room, Devon realized the main exit was entirely blocked by federal agents. He spun around, abandoning all pretense of calm, and made a desperate, frantic sprint toward the kitchen doors. Before he could even reach his hand out to grab the brass handle, Paige stepped directly into his path. She physically blocked the exit, her eyes burning with a cold, unforgiving fire. Devon snarled at her, demanding she move out of his way. Instead, Paige slowly reached into her small silk evening bag. She withdrew 2 specific items and held them up in the dim light for him to see. In her left hand was his dark blue international passport. In her right hand was the heavy titanium encrypted flash drive containing the complete digital backup of his illegal double ledgers. She had quietly removed both items from his precious leather briefcase while everyone was entirely distracted by my entrance. Devon stopped dead in his tracks. All the color drained from his perfectly tanned face. He stared at the 2 objects in his wife's hands, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. He was completely trapped. stripped of his money, his escape route, and his leverage. The grand illusion had been violently shattered, and the true cost of their arrogance was finally ready to be collected. Grant lunged forward, his face contorted into a mask of desperate, spittle-flecked rage. He kicked his chair out of the way, the heavy wood clattering loudly against the floorboards. He screamed that I was completely destroying his family home, that I had absolutely no legal or moral right to march into his ancestral estate and transform a charity gala into a public execution. His voice echoed wildly, the frantic shrieks of a man watching his entire fabricated universe collapse in real time. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply raised my left wrist and looked at the dial of my watch. It was exactly 9:15 in the evening, right on cue. The heavy oak double doors at the main entrance did not just open, they were aggressively pushed wide. A coordinated procession of personnel marched into the reception hall. Leading the group was the senior director of the property management firm I had contracted, flanked closely by 3 uniformed county sheriff deputies and 2 commercial locksmiths carrying heavy tool bags. The senior director stepped to the center of the room. Holding the stamped writ of possession high in the air, he announced in a booming voice that the Winter Lantern benefit was officially and permanently shut down. He instructed the bartenders to immediately step away from the alcohol stations. The state charity fraud officers moved swiftly to the entrance tables, slapping red evidence tape across the donation drop boxes and entirely sealing the fraudulent fundraising records. Panic, raw and unadulterated, swept through the remaining crowd. The wealthy socialites and prominent local business owners, the very people Lorraine had spent a lifetime trying to impress, were practically climbing over each other to reach the coat check. They fled the grand hall in a chaotic stampede of rustling silk and hurried, horrified whispers. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with a federal crime scene. Through the massive front windows, I watched the luxury vehicles peeling out of the gravel driveway, their headlights cutting through the dark winter night. The rumors they carried with them would spread through the affluent suburbs far faster than any manipulative social media post my mother-in-law could ever dream of composing. The Mercer family name was officially dead. In the center of the room, the authorities began processing the wreckage. A federal investigator calmly placed a hand on Devon's shoulder, informing him that he was being formally detained for questioning regarding systemic commercial fraud and the active embezzlement of client escrow funds. Devon did not fight back. He looked completely defeated, his eyes hollow as he stared at the floor, finally separated from his precious leather briefcase. A few feet away, the second investigator handed Lorraine a thick, terrifyingly official envelope. He explicitly informed her that she was receiving a formal subpoena and would be facing imminent federal indictment charges related to felony cyber extortion and severe charitable fund misappropriation. Lorraine did not scream this time. She collapsed entirely into a nearby dining chair, her hands shaking so violently she could not even hold the paperwork. The queen of the local country club was reduced to a hyperventilating, terrified suspect. Grant, however, was still desperately clinging to the very last shred of his delusion. He marched right up to the property management director, aggressively jabbing his finger at the man's chest, screaming that White Laurel belonged to him and demanding that the trespassers leave his property immediately. The director simply opened his clipboard and pulled out the finalized property deed and the terminated management agreement. He held the documents directly in front of Grant's face. He explained, with brutal bureaucratic clarity, that the Mercer family had never possessed any actual legal ownership of the estate. He stated that their temporary residency and operational status had been permanently revoked due to gross financial negligence and criminal fraud. As if to punctuate the director's statement, the loud, grinding screech of a heavy power drill echoed through the grand foyer. The commercial locksmiths were already systematically removing the brass lock cylinders from the main entrance doors right in front of their eyes. Outside, a flatbed truck was actively hauling away the rented outdoor heating lamps. A worker in a high-visibility jacket was placing a thick metal chain and a heavy padlock across the secondary logistics gate. The kingdom was not just falling, it was being actively dismantled and repossessed. Grant slowly turned around. The opulent reception hall was now completely empty of guests, stripped of its music, and stripped of its dignity. He looked at his mother, who was weeping uncontrollably into her hands. He looked at Devon, who was being escorted out the back doors by federal agents. He looked at his sister Paige, who was already walking down the long driveway with her coat pulled tight, never once looking back. Finally, Grant looked at me. The arrogant, entitled brand strategist vanished entirely. In his place stood a pathetic, thoroughly broken man. He stumbled toward me, the false bravado entirely replaced by desperate, sickening subservience. He completely changed his tone. He threw his own mother and his brother-in-law directly under the bus, loudly blaming Lorraine for the financial ruin and blaming Devon for the illegal wire transfers. He reached out, his hands trembling, and begged me for a second chance. He swore on his life that he would change. He promised he would get a real job, work 40 hours a week, and cut off his family entirely if I would just stop the legal machine and let him come home to me. I looked at him for a long, quiet moment. I absorbed the sight of a man who only recognized my value when his own survival depended entirely upon it. "I am not doing this to punish you, Grant," I said, my voice as cold and absolute as a winter wind. "I am simply following your own instructions. You were the one who sent the text message. You said you wanted to distance yourself from me. You explicitly told me not to come looking for you. I am just respecting your wishes with total legal, financial, and moral permanence." I turned my back on him. I walked out through the grand double doors, stepping into the crisp night air, leaving him standing alone in the ruins of a life he never actually earned. 6 months later, the dust finally settled into a permanent reality. My highly aggressive attorney finalized the divorce proceedings with surgical efficiency, leaving Grant with absolutely no claim to my assets. At Harrogate Assurance, my handling of the internal fraud investigation resulted in a massive promotion to Senior Vice President of Risk Management. Grant currently works a grueling night shift at a regional logistics warehouse. The vast majority of his meager paycheck is aggressively garnished by the federal government to repay his staggering tax debts and fraud penalties. Lorraine lost her home, her social standing, and her country club membership. She currently lives in a tiny, rented studio apartment, existing under strict legal monitoring while trying to pay back the stolen charity restitution. Devon is awaiting trial and faces severe, multi-year financial charges. Paige successfully relocated 3 states away, changed her phone number, and is finally rebuilding a quiet, honest life completely free from the toxic gravity of her family. Tonight, I am standing on the sprawling glass balcony of my new, high-rise penthouse apartment in the center of the financial district. I am holding a glass of expensive red wine, looking down at the glittering city lights spread out below me. The air is cool and peaceful. I take a slow sip of the wine and smile, finally understanding the absolute truth about justice. The most beautiful, satisfying revenge in the world is not about screaming louder than the villains or tearing them down with your own hands. It is simply about quietly pulling out the foundation, walking away, and watching them realize that everything they thought they owned was actually being generously provided by the very person they tried to destroy. Thank you all so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are listening from. So please drop a comment below with your city or country so we can connect and share our thoughts on this crazy situation. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel. Give this video a like, and support the channel even more by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.